Well, well. I can't believe it, guys, but here it is. We are finally here. And literally, I was just 5 seconds ago, I pressed record, and somebody is drilling outside. So, I really don't have to, close the, I'm going to have to close the window, because right now the smell in this room is not quite great at the moment, but I guess I'm going to have to do it. Now, first of all, I have to preface, if it sounds like I'm stalling a little bit, it's because, well, there is, I said at the end of part 84 that, well, we're going to have to, I want to do things a little bit differently for part 85. You see, what I'm going to do is that we are going to go through, segments of part 85, and we'll splice them all together anyway, but we kind of need to take everything in one step at a time, because, well, if you got to this point, ladies and gentlemen, well, it does mean, well, this is it. This is it. This is the end of Christory. This is the end of the dimensions merging together. This is the end of Sonic 2 as a franchise. This is the end of the boyfriend-free girl search. This is the end of basically trying to find any sense of normalcy left in this world. And it's the end of Christory as we know it. So, to start, guys, let's take this back a little bit, because if you were to tell me 5 years ago, when I first started watching this series, is that this is where it would all lead to, well, Chris is to not only being Chris being arrested, Chris being in the clink for 2 years, Chris getting out of prison at all, and circumstances in which Chris is now having to live separately with an unknown alias who is only known to the world as Flutter. And, well, Chris, when you think about it, when you think about what happened before Chris got arrested, and when you think about what happened after Chris got out of jail and what exactly she's been up to since, you would have to admit, for some strange reason, Chris seemed to have gotten pretty much the best part of all of this. She lost you may say, well, you can't really say that much because she lost 2 years of her life. Well, I would say, I would argue the semantics about whether or not Chris actually lost out on anything. Because, well, think about it. Chris got to be in a place where the rent was never due. Chris was locked in a place where trolls, really, to be honest, nobody could really get to Chris. Now, with that being said, I do know that in March of 2022, Chris was completely incommunicado because, for those who don't know, Chris actually had to be transferred from Central Virginia Regional Jail to Western, I think it was the Western State Hospital, because they determined that for whatever reason, Chris was not actually fit to stand trial, because March was supposed to be when Chris got her third hearing, but because she was deemed medically unfit to stand trial, she was transferred to basically a psychiatric hospital. The one thing that Chris's parents had pretty much basically scaremongered Chris into for years, that you should never ever visit. And what would you guess? What? Who would have thought that that's exactly what would have happened? Although, unfortunately, again, Chris didn't. Well, fortunately, give or take, Chris didn't stay there for very long, and these are the things I'm going to be covering when I do my fan-made part 86. And actually, while we have this opportunity, I think we may as well talk about what exactly part 86 is going to consist of, and when guys are going to be able to see it. So the plan is that part 86 is meant to be coming out about a week after this video gets uploaded. Now, with that being said, I do kind of want to get it finished before this video goes up, because I want to actually send a copy to Gino Samuel first, only just because I wanted to hear what he thought he wanted to say, and You never know. I might literally just give him the script, if you will, just so he can do a dub over it and say it's his own. Because honestly, we do have to sort of like give a salute, if you will, to Gino Samuel, because that man has been an absolute trooper. Doing the sort of task that no ordinary person should tread, talking about the life and crimes of Christian Weston Chandler. So, if there's one person that absolutely needs to be credited more than anything else for doing the right thing by observing Christory as opposed to being a part of it. I mean, there have been parts of this where Gino has had to include himself only because they sort of fit into the realm, but then again, I couldn't imagine. Gino strikes me as far too professional to know better than to all of a sudden like get involved in stuff like this. With that being said, however, apparently this is declared the end of season 1, which, to be honest, an end of a season, really, and it's only taken 85 parts to get to here. That's a bit wild when you put it in that perspective. But it's also kind of actually, I suppose the only other thing I could think to ask before we like end part 1 of this is that, well, I'm surprised like they've never ever thought to do like an award for Gino Samuel, something that goes far beyond a silver or gold play button. Maybe an award for outstanding documentary series on YouTube, because to be honest, I feel like Gino probably deserves that. He deserves some level of recognition for not only his documentative skills, but for the fact that he actually has had he went through with this. And he did absolutely everything by the book. And, well, that's kind of how we got to where we are today. So thank you, Gino. Thank you so much for doing this for us. And one of these days, I certainly want to be able to cover your other documentaries, because he's done quite a lot of other things on his channel. It's not, well, I think it's on Gino Samuel 3.0, where he does like his other documentaries. I know he's done like a short little series about like Japanese monsters, or Shimigami, if you will, or just your bog standard yokai. But we'll come to those. Let me know if you want me to cover those. I'll do them on this separate channel, so we should be tight on that. Now, that, believe it or not, was the that's what I call the end of part 1 of this video, because now we have to get into what I am absolutely going to be calling part 2. I promise you we will get to actually talking about the video soon, but I've never had the opportunity to do this before, but since this is probably the first and last time we'll be able to do this, so let's actually talk about the thumbnail that they went with. And it should come as no surprise to everybody that it is, well, it's Christine's arrest report, and it's a snap picture of Chris's mugshot. Now, for anyone who remembers what happened at the end of 2014, in fact, actually, I've got an idea. Let's do that right now. Let's do a little comparison. So, this is Chris on, what was it, the Prime Minister of Ireland tweeted this. What does... No, maybe somebody else did that. Anyway, you can see Chris looking disheveled. Maybe she had like actually straightened her hair that day, and well, from this you would gather the impression that Chris here did not know what the hell she was doing. She probably didn't even have a clue about what on earth she was even getting arrested for. As far as she was concerned, she was absolutely in the right, and she honestly couldn't be bothered with this. Please bear in mind, guys, that Chris abandoned her mother at Fashion Square Mall. So, ironically, this does sort of, in a strange roundabout way, not only does it involve violence, it also involves Bob and more elder abuse again by abandoning your elderly parent whilst you went to not only pepper spray somebody inadvertently, that's what you may say, inadvertently, yes, but it still happened nonetheless. And Chris just kind of looks like she just couldn't care less, really. So I know a lot of people are understandably annoyed when they see stuff like this, and yes, it absolutely is an absolute pain in the neck when this happens, and there's not a shred of like guilt. It's more a shred of it's self-pity more than anything else. And well, anybody who knows anything about Chris, you would say that sort of fits the bill, because yes, absolutely, Chris, whenever it comes to issues of the law, Chris is always under the impression that she is automatically in the right because of A, B, and C. Compare this, however, to 7 years later, and this is Chris's mugshot from when Chris was arrested on the 1st of August of 2021. This one kind of annoys me for different reasons, because here, Chris kind of looks a little too comfortable. She looks a little bit too, like, it hasn't actually registered with her yet exactly not only what she had done, but what this was all, what was going to happen to her. It hadn't because now listen, because of this, I do have a few other things I want to put in, because throughout this week I want to cover basically every single detail of everything that happened. And one of those things I'll have to do is I have to take a look at the actual footage of Chris actually being arrested at the motel in August. And among many of the things, yes, I have heard apparently Chris admitted that Maggie-chan apparently wanted Chris to fight back or taser the arresting officer. I legitimately couldn't tell you why on earth Chris would ever say something like that. I mean, we know fine well Chris has also gone on record saying that Chris kicked a police car 5 times because, and I quote, she always wanted to get something back at them. So are you really trying to tell me that now again, whether or not Chris has ever been, I would say, legitimately insane, is something that it's a very, very difficult thing to say, because it's a very sensitive topic, because when it comes to issues regarding insanity, probably more than anything else, I would have to say to myself is that, are they absolutely serious? Like, has like an officer ever sat Chris down, or anybody in a position of authority sat Chris down, whether it's a lawyer, a police officer, something like that, or maybe even, I don't know, probably a fireman or something like that. Has any of them ever sat Chris down and said, "Chris, are you absolutely sure you're serious about this? You're absolutely sure there is such a place called Quickville, and you also believe that there's apparently such a thing as a soup hotel, and that sort of thing is comparable to any sort of reality, even in a fantasy one." And if Chris actually turned around and say, "Yes, and I can see them right now," and I would, again, okay, maybe that's why we sort of have to actually, like, maybe do a bit of a discussion about what for insofar as what the law says, or at least the law in the state of Virginia, what technically counts as insanity, and what actually counts as, well, Chris will just believe whatever she's being told at the time. Because you have to remember, it wasn't like this was a thing that sprouted out just because Chris couldn't go to BabsCon in 2020, which led to the that whole episode, that 8-month episode of Chris LARPing as Sonichu for whatever. I still don't even, to be honest, I've watched like all those parts, and even I can't work out why on earth Chris thought, what was the intention, what was the end goal, what was the way, what did Chris think was going to happen by pretending to be Sonichu for that amount of time? Because nothing changed from it. The only thing that actually resulted in this is that Chris tried to be manipulated by Prater and like Nort into trying to tase Chris, and for some reason Chris was more than happy to be in on this. And, well, yeah, that maybe that's one of those things that probably is like realming on insanity. Well, insanity, or the other option as well is that Chris is, well, suffering from some sort of neurotic levels of like brain damage or something. Maybe it's more of a traumatic. Well, Chris has been through quite a lot of what a lot of people would describe as traumatic incidences. Surprisingly, a lot of these seem to suggest the idea that Chris is actually kind of okay a little bit, because the whole thing about Julie and Blue Spike, yes, Chris was very, very upset, but it's not the sort of thing that Chris went on years later to say, I never ever got over that sort of thing. Now, whether or not Chris is, again, telling the truth about stuff like that, it's a bit hard to say, because we know fine well Chris is, well, an unreliable narrator at the best of times. Yeah, it's very difficult to say what, or determine what Chris is legitimately feeling, what Chris is legitimately thinking, and whether or not Chris even knows herself what she's even doing or what she's talking about. Now, you've heard me mention a couple of times over the last couple of weeks is that Chris had seemingly got to the stage in about, I'd say, part 69, that Chris was starting to lose the power of rational thought, and Chris was also starting to lose the ability to legitimately make her own decisions of her own free will. And that wasn't even anything to do with the idea, guys, but it's almost as if, like, what I'm trying to say behind that is that whether or not you ever sat down Chris and say, Chris, why are you doing this? Do you reckon Chris would be able to give like a legitimate answer, or would Chris just say something that she doesn't agree with, or she doesn't agree with 100%? There are lots of you see, this is why I honestly wanted to be able to do it in this way, because this is in case studies, because in years to come there will be case studies when it comes to people like, not just like Chris, when it comes to people like Terry Davis or Randy Stair or DSP or King World of T-Shirts or Wings of Redemption, or even like Dr. Disrespect and possibly even Pokimane when you think about it. But then you have to also to understand the logic or the trail of rational thought, or their cognitive dissonance, if you will, as to why they do the things they do. And don't even get me started on people who are like well and truly like facing like longer sentences, like Johnny Somali. One of these days I absolutely am going to cover the entire story of Johnny Somali. But until we know what the South Korean authorities are going to do with Somali, and bear in mind South Korea is still currently under martial law as of the recording of this video, the 15th of March 2025. We are maybe they'll be far stricter towards Somali, maybe because Somali is a foreigner to the South Koreans, or whether or not it's just because, well, martial law does impact jail terms for some reason or another. It's ironic as well that he's facing jail specifically in South Korea. Like, they haven't even discussed the idea of deportation yet. Maybe that's possibly a symptom of like martial law or something. I don't know. Anyway, back to Chris. I suppose, again, when it comes to the only other thing I want to say before we end, well, part 2, is that there's a clip from when Chris was released, and Chris started doing a live stream, and all of a sudden somebody sends a message via super chat, and all Chris could do is just sort of like look down at her medallion, kind of like a little bit sullen, and she looks like she's like she feels guilty. Not in this. She doesn't look guilty here. That is not the face of somebody who feels guilty about what they've done. And if you're going to say to me right now is that Chris has no reason to feel guilty, I'm going to, well, by the time we finish part 85, you're going to find out why Chris probably, and bear in mind this again, this is also a picture of Chris actually, like, I know this is a bit small, but this is Chris smiling as she's actually dabbed in prison in a prison uniform. And then of course you get later when Chris's hair's grown out and she's obviously not happy anymore. And then at a later date, I think this was like the latest one before Chris was arrested, in which Chris sort of like has lost weight. This might have been after Chris went to reach the Western State Hospital. The more I think about it, maybe this was before Chris went, which is kind of insane when you think about it. So maybe it is absolutely true that Chris, like, I don't think she realized what she was doing. Now, whether you want to say this is because Chris was completely under the impression that she was still a goddess and therefore she was going to get out of this no matter what. Well, we all know how how well that ended. And please bear in mind, there's also things to cover after Chris got the emergency protective order and before Chris was actually arrested. Things involving Noel, but then again, this was basically Noel cutting ties with Chris anyway. I'm going to be covering that entire live stream. It's like 30 minutes of like Noel talking about his final communications with Chris. Since, well, spoiler alert, if Noel ever gets mentioned again in regards to Christory, it will be in some very passive form because, well, to say what happened, to say the backlash was immense, and the fact that everybody just decided they didn't want to have anything to do with Chris whatsoever, because outside of that, they all thought that Chris's time in the spotlight was coming to an end because, well, there was quite a lot of other people who completely had it in and were finished talking about Chris by that point anyway. I know Dylan Thomas didn't have anything else to say. Gibby still continued to talk about Chris, but that was more to do with the fact that Dylan Thomas was pretty much like quitting YouTube anyway. But, well, we are nearly 25 minutes into this recording, and the only thing we've covered up to this point is, well, the zeitgeist surrounding this actual series, and, well, the thumbnail, and a lot of other little mini things that I'll probably be referencing again later. So, yeah, with those out of the way, now we can actually start talking about part 85. May God have mercy on your souls.